Has your landlord increased your rent yet? By how much? Does he have the right to do that? And how is he supposed to do that? We have all the answers right here. So let's get straight to the point. With the economic hardship as we see it in this country, the prices of everything is going up. And of course, landlords are increasing rent. So as a tenant, what is your right in this regard? And as a landlord, what is your right in this regard? How are you supposed to go about it? We have right here with me, Mr. Nwachukwu Obiezu. He is a legal practitioner and an expert when it comes to tenancy matters. So let's go ahead and ask this question. Number one, do landlords have a right to increase their rent? And what is the right way, according to the law, to do that?
Thank you for having me in your studio. They do have the right to increase the rent. And if they have to increase their rent, the relationship between landlord and tenant is regulated by the tenancy agreement. And in some cases, and almost cases, you see that provision is inserted in that agreement. That in the case where the landlord intends to increase his rent, he shall notify the tenant in writing.
It must be in writing.
If you people expressly indicate that it has to be in writing, that means he must reduce it to writing. So you don't just increase rent unilaterally. You will inform the tenant that, yes, I want to increase the rent to X amount of money, so that the tenant will check his pocket, check his earnings, and see if he can still afford that place. If it is not convenient for him, he tell you, please, I can no longer afford this. Let me find another place. Do you understand?
But is there room for negotiation for how much? Because a landlord can say, I want to increase my rent from, let's say, from 800,000 naira to 1.2 million. And the tenant says, I can't afford it, but can we do 1 million? Is there room for this kinds of negotiation?
Definitely. It is for the tenant himself who is going to bear the burden of paying that rent to, call the landlord to around and say, please, I can only afford 1 million. I can't afford 1.2. If it's okay by the landlord will say, okay, it's fine. I will consider that. If it's not okay by the landlord will say, okay, that means you cannot afford my house anymore. Then find another place.
So what's the time frame in which the landlord has to express the interest to increase rent? What's the amount of time that a tenant has to have to get ready for this?
Actually, the tenant is entitled to sufficient time, at least 6 months.
At least?
At least 6 months. Unless they waived it in that tenancy agreement to say that he shall issue me with such increment in writing for, that is 1 month towards the expiration of his tenancy. Unless there is a waiver as contained in the tenancy agreement. If it's not there in the tenancy agreement, or if the waiver is not there, you issue him with a 6 months.
But realistically, if your landlord tells you that he wants to increase his rent, he writes you this letter, anytime before or after 6 months, if I should use that, maybe 5 months, 3 months, 2 months, a month at a time, what does that mean? What can you do as a tenant? Because a lot of tenants right now are experiencing that.
Yes, if he issues such notice of increment, like 2 months before the expiration of your tenancy, and you're a yearly tenant, you understand, which means you're entitled to 6 months notice. So he ought to issue a 6 months notice with regards to the increment. You understand? And if eventually he issues it within 2 months before the expiration of it, that means if you're paying for the next year, you can pay him 1 year of the old rent.
Oh, let me get this straight. So let's say your rent expires 31st of December.
Yes.
And he issues you a notice of increment in rent in November.
In November.
So 31st of December, you can still pay him the old rent.
Yes, I'm saying this in the absence of such waivers as contained in the tenancy agreement.
Okay, so in the absence of that,
you are entitled to at least 6 months notice of that increment.
And if it doesn't give you 6 months, you can still pay your old rent.
You can still pay your old rent.
And
Then you people will now continue to deliberate to sort it out.
And then the new rent might come up next year, 31st of December.
Yes.
So it's incumbent on the landlord to make sure that he gives you ample time.
Yes, reasonable time.
Reasonable time.
Yes.
For a 1-year tenancy agreement, it has to be 6 months.
It has to.
At least you have that information, so you know what to tell your landlord. It's not like you don't know anymore. Let's talk about the percentage increase, because I have heard people who have said that their landlords have increased their rent by 100%. Is there anything in the law that talks about the percentage that a landlord can increase the rent?
There is nothing particularly. However, you don't just increase rent to 100%, give 100% increment. It's unacceptable. It is usually better, at least the maximum landlords can do, or is acceptable by landlords, is 50%.
Is about 50.
Or
lesser,
below.
much lesser,
Yes.
50% and below.
Or below, yeah.
But anything above that,
it's not acceptable.
if you go to court, would you be able to get any sort
Well, if you go to court, all those things, we that are in practice, we know how it works. You understand? All those things vary from the mind of the court.
Okay.
Do you understand? So, like as I say, in my own opinion, as a legal practitioner, I think the maximum should be 50%.
But it's not spelled out
It's
by
not,
the law. At the end of the day, it's still solely on the landlord how much he is going to increase his rent by. Okay, so let's go further and actually talk about, let's assume that the landlord decides to throw you out of the premises and the landlord refuses to give you your 6 months and refuses to follow the law. For the sake of the landlord here, because we're trying to make sure that both the tenant and the landlord are represented, because our viewers are, most of them are tenants, most of them are landlords as well. So as a landlord, you want to get rid of this particular tenant and probably you don't want a rent increment. How do you do that? What's the right way according to the law to do that?
Well, in Abuja here we have the Recovery of Premises Act. And that law clearly specifies the process through which you can get rid of someone who is staying in your house. And before you do so, there are preliminary issues before you start initiating the proceedings in court. And these preliminary issues are the issuance of the 2 relevant statutory notices before you get to court. These statutory notices are the notice to quit and the 7 days owner's intention to recover possession. It is compulsory that you issue these 2 statutory notices before you start initiating any action in court.
Okay, so how long is the notice to quit?
Well, the notice to quit is if the tenant is a weekly tenant, he's entitled to a week notice. If the tenant is a monthly tenant, he's entitled to one month notice. If the tenant is a quarterly tenant, is entitled to quarterly notice. If the person is a 1-year tenant, he's entitled to 6 months notice to quit. This is provided, I think, in the Section 8 of the Recovery of Premises Act.
Especially here in Abuja.
Yes. When I talk about the Recovery of Premises, I mean Abuja, the one that applies to Abuja. Yes.
So your landlord cannot wake up and say, I want you to move out tomorrow.
He cannot. It is the court that can evict any tenant from the house.
Not a landlord.
Not the landlord.
So in the cases where we see a landlord come in and throw people out using the law enforcement agents like the police and the rest, that is against the law.
That is absolutely against the law.
And what should the tenant do in that regard?
Well, when it has been done, you will go you approach the court to make good of your right, which has been violated.
Probably seek damage.
You see, when you pay rent to a landlord, you have possessory rights
of the premises.
Of the premises. The landlord cannot even just walk into that house because it is his own. You are protected. Before he comes into that house, he has to notify you that he's coming. He doesn't just wake up and walk into the premises like that. You have the possessory right. What he has is the reversionary right.
Should you always have a tenancy agreement?
It is very, very necessary to ensure that you demand that tenancy agreement in writing. And not only that, you both parties must sign it.
Can one tenancy agreement at the beginning of the contract cover for all the number of years that you're going to live there? Or are you supposed to have a fresh tenancy agreement every time you pay your rent?
There are some tenancy agreements you will see. The way it will be couched, it will be for a fixed time certain. This is litigation. At some point, you might even be litigating a matter. Getting to the judgment period, the presiding officer will die.